If you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor, at least until Me Too comes for him. That's my subject on today's Fiamengo File. I'm Janice Fiamengo of the University of Ottawa. The sentencing hearing of former Olympics team doctor Larry Nassar, who was given 40 to 175 years in prison for molesting female gymnasts and other athletes, is a portent of things to come, in my opinion. The hearing was notable for the manner in which Judge Rosemary Aquilina made no attempt to control her vaunting hatred. "I've just signed your death warrant," she gloated, in what I found an unseemly display of rage. She had been listening to testimony by Nassar's victims, and she spoke to Nassar not as a judge to a convicted criminal, but as a woman to a despicable man. Putting aside the particular subject of Larry Nassar, I want to focus here on the peril of male doctors in general in this time of mass accusation. Doctors are, of course, particularly vulnerable to the feminist mob. Many have spent thousands of hours examining female patients behind closed doors, doing the pap smears and the breast exams that they're required to do. They probably won't be doing that much longer. I suspect they'll soon have female nurses present whenever a patient has to disrobe, and imagine the increased expense of that. But given that there is no statute of limitations on sexual assault charges, and given that the police and the courts are zealous to pursue alleged abuse, many male doctors have reason to be breaking a sweat. Angry women have traditionally had a special dislike of male doctors, who are often depicted as symbols of the most hated form of patriarchal power. According to Professor Mary Daly, in her book Gynecology, the Metaethics of Radical Feminism, the rise of the male medical profession necessitated the massacre of wise women during the witch craze in medieval Europe. Would-be medical men, according to Daly, needed to kill off the female healers in their villages in order to take their places. The notion that only women were killed as witches in medieval Europe has been thoroughly discredited by historians, but the myth remains potent. And in general, many feminist accounts describe the practice of medicine as the ultimate patriarchal system, with the male doctor as the locus of knowledge and power, and the woman a passive object, her body controlled, objectified, and abused. As the authors of the study Social Theory, Health and Healthcare make clear, quote, Foucault's notion of the clinical gaze has been taken up by feminist sociologists and health activists to critique the medical appropriation of women's bodies, end quote. Fast forward to the Me Too moment, beginning in the fall of 2017, in which women empowered themselves by calling out men's predatory behavior, whether criminal or not, and in which how the woman felt is at least as important as what she objectively experienced. With, for example, Tina Dupuis in the Atlantic Monthly going so far as to say that Al Franken's squeeze of her waist during a photo op made her feel, quote, no longer a person. In this climate of finger-pointing melodrama, it is no surprise that male doctors are now in the crosshairs of accusing women. Many of us have felt apprehensive, queasy, and embarrassed in a doctor's office at some point. But Me Too has given a large number of women permission to translate such feelings into criminal allegations that can ruin a man's life. The title of an October 2017 article by Alison Knopp in an online magazine makes the connection clear. Quote, my Me Too moments happened in the doctor's office, she writes. Knopp claims to have experienced, quote, multiple sexual traumas at the hands of male doctors beginning when I was 9 years old. It's significant that the writer calls what happened to her trauma, an elastic term referring not to a specific external reality, but to an intense psychological and emotional response. Knopp doesn't tell us what caused the trauma, as is her right, but she doesn't hesitate to describe it as assault, even while admitting the difficulty of determining what is and is not abuse in cases where an incident is being recalled many years after the fact, and in which the feeling of shame or humiliation is the primary defining criterion. Knopp writes that, quote, in many cases of sexual trauma and abuse, the victim may doubt herself as her in-shock brain tries to process what happened, and it can be especially difficult in the case of a patient who may question whether the clinician who did something to her that felt wrong actually did something wrong, or whether what happened was medically necessary, end quote. This is a revealing sentence. At first glance, it may seem to be saying that it's difficult to determine in the context of medical procedures whether what feels wrong actually is wrong. In other words, women should be careful about what they name as abuse. But that's not what this writer is saying. When we return to the first clause of the sentence, we're reminded that she begins, quote, in many cases of sexual trauma and abuse, the victim may doubt herself. In other words, there is no existential doubt about the fact of abuse. There's only the victim's felt doubt within herself. And because trauma creates doubt, according to feminist theory, by definition, self-doubt is part of trauma, even proof of trauma. And indeed, commentators on Knopp's article are similarly enthusiastic about naming discomfort as abuse, even when it isn't sexual. One commentator speaks of the humiliation of having to walk in front of doctors and medical students after hip surgery as a young girl, feeling herself the victim of the collective male gaze. This is what she says, quote, when I entered the exam room, I was required to strip down to my underwear, no gown, because they needed to see my gait as I walked and see how my hips moved. I was asked to walk across the room, turn, stand on one leg, lift my arms up. It was humiliating. After the demonstrations, the students would gather around me with all sorts of questions that were so demeaning and devoid of any empathy as to what a young girl would possibly be feeling, standing there in her underwear, exposed to them. They would bend my arms, move my legs up and down while feeling my hips. It was traumatizing. Was it sexual in nature? No, I never felt sexually violated. However, a line was very much crossed, end quote. But what line was crossed? And how? Nothing that she describes is objectively abusive, at least in my opinion. She even notes that her mother was always present in the room. Well, likely the exams were unpleasant and perhaps could have been handled better. I'm not, of course, suggesting that abuse doesn't happen or that the feelings of these women aren't worth attending to, but I am struck by their unwillingness to admit that feeling humiliated doesn't equate to abuse. Now, the psychobiological roots of these feelings are undoubtedly complex and surely exacerbated during a physical exam in which the female body is exposed to the medical gaze and medical touch. And surely decades of feminist theorizing about the damage of the male gaze have buttressed and encouraged outraged claims of malpractice. I don't think I am exaggerating in predicting a Me Too attack on male doctors in which one of the overt features of the mobbing will be the doctor's exposure to the pitiless and dehumanizing gaze of journalists and the wider public. Consider the case of Dr. Vincent Nadon, an Ottawa doctor with a decades-long practice at the University of Ottawa Health Clinic. Nadon was my doctor for 10 years when I lived in Ottawa, and I always found him to be extremely competent, professional, knowledgeable. Obviously, I'm not in any position to pronounce on his guilt or his innocence, but I can note the spectacular manner in which he has been criminalized before trial. In January of 2018, Dr. Nadon was arrested and charged with sexual assault and voyeurism after a female patient said that she had, quote, become suspicious that she was being recorded during a medical examination by Nédon at the University of Ottawa Health Services Clinic. The basis for the suspicion has never been explained, and we don't know whether any recording was actually found. It's also not clear whether the charge of voyeurism and the charge of sexual assault relate to one and the same incident. I'm assuming that they do. As a result of changes to the Canadian Criminal Code in 1985, sexual assault can be defined extremely broadly, which it would need to be, as it's hard to imagine in this case anything approaching a conventional assault happening at the busy clinic where Nédon worked, where there were always at least half a dozen doctors and nurses and many more patients in the corridors that connect to the examining rooms. Following his arrest, Dr. Nédon's name and face were splashed all over the news, and he was treated like a highly dangerous sex criminal, a threat to society. He was jailed, he was placed under 30-day house arrest upon his release, he was forced to surrender his passport, and he was prohibited from using any recording devices or even from accessing the internet, unless in the presence of his wife or brother who posted bail for him. Moreover, the Ottawa police made a plea for help, declaring their near certainty that there were more victims out there and asking anyone with information about Nédon to come forward. And come forward they did. Within a month, there were 10 additional counts of sexual assault against the doctor from 10 different, quote, victims, reaching as far back as 1995. And even in the most recent reports about the additional charges, the police are still expressing concern that there are likely more victims they hope will come forward. They're sending a clear message, it couldn't be any clearer, that Vincent Nédon is guilty. Now, Nédon is no longer under house arrest, but he is essentially a prisoner in his own home. His position at the clinic has been terminated, not suspended. His reputation has been destroyed. His face has been burned into the memories of hundreds of thousands of members of the reading public. He has nothing left to do in his life but wait for his trial, which will likely not take place for years, and of course, contemplate the crushing of every professional dream he ever had. He'll spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, perhaps $500,000 on a lawyer to defend him against charges that are essentially impossible to defend against. How prove that a claimed assault from 1995 never took place? For that matter, how prove a claimed assault from yesterday never took place? Even if Nédon is found not guilty, he will almost certainly never work as a doctor again, and the life he had can never be recovered. His accusers, of course, whether bogus or not, will remain shielded from public view. Their dignity must be protected, but nobody gives a bloody damn about the dignity of a man who has not yet even been tried. What Nédon's case shows most clearly, in my opinion, is the extent to which our society is already what Me Too hashtaggers envision, in which men are pilloried from the moment someone accuses them. What a barbarous practice it is to publish the name of the accused and to call for more accusers. Why publish his name and picture before trial if not to ruin his life? How does it help justice? Why plea for more accusers if not to load up a trial with women already coached about what to say simply by reading the newspaper? If we don't permit jury members to serve who have read too much about a case and already made up their mind, why would we permit that in accusers? Even if Nédon is guilty, which I admit it possible he is, the manner in which his case has been set up is completely tainted, in my opinion. And if he's innocent, the depth of betrayal is beyond words.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please support us on Patreon. If even half of our subscribers gave us $1 per month, we'd be well on our way to creating more and better content. And don't forget to subscribe to us on Studio Brûlé.